Yeah, hi everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of seminars around the Your DNA, Your Say study and around genomic data sharing. Just a reminder that we are recording the seminar, so and that recording will be available on the website as soon as it's ready. It's a great pleasure today to welcome Torsten and Barbara to talk about the findings from the kind of Your DNA, Your Say German arm. So Torsten Voigt is Professor of Sociology and Chair of Technology and Diversity at the Institute of Sociology at RWTH Aachen University. And his research focuses on the social framing and societal implications of biomedical, genetic and neuroscientific research. And Barbara Prainsack is a political scientist with expertise in the regulatory, social and ethical dimensions of bioscience, biomedicine and forensics. And she's Professor of Comparative Policy Analysis at the University of Vienna and a member of the European Commission Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies. And I'm really looking forward to hearing about their work and to discussing it afterwards. So I'll, Barbara, I think I'm handing over to you. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll collect them and at the end. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you Anna for inviting us, and thank you everyone for taking the time. As Richard already mentioned, Torsten and I will present some of the newer data analysis that we've done, specifically also the qualitative data from the German arm. So you might hear this or not. I'm not German, I'm Austrian. Nevertheless, we did focus on the German data and not on German-speaking countries or regions. More broadly, it's really strictly speaking the German data that we will be talking about. So here, there's no need to introduce the Your DNA, Your Say study, of course. This is just to say that we are very happy to continue to participate and to be part of this wonderful group. We've learned so much. I had the pleasure of being involved from the early stages, and it has been an amazing experience to be part of this group. So on the basis of the German data, and it was exactly 1,506 respondents, Torsten and I, together with a group, published in 2020 a first analysis of some of the findings that we considered most relevant and most interesting. And those findings, on the one hand, compare the German data with the global findings. And here in particular, we will go into comparisons with English-speaking countries. I will also tell you why we focus on this comparison. And then this was 2020, right? So we had a lot of plans, and then the pandemic happened. So we only got around doing the analysis of the open response data and the qualitative data that we received as part of the survey now. So we are very, very excited about this. However, I think we're finding results that raise some questions that also shed light on some of the themes, and this is what I will be talking about now, just after giving you the broad context and the most important summary, the summary of the most important findings from our already published data. So this slide, many of you will recognize. This comes from one of the first and most important papers, also from the Your DNA, Your Say study, in the sense that it looked at global public perception. So this is the one with the awesome sample size, with a global sample size. And as you know, of course, one of the findings was that it depends on how you look at it. One could say a low willingness to make data available for research, but one could also say overall a surprisingly high willingness in some countries where there were already they already had scandals about data use, and where trust, and this is something that Richard has done a lot of work on as well, where trust was already shaken. So, but overall, these are the global data. Almost half would not make their data available for research. And data means the medical or DNA data. 52 would do that. So this is a bit over half to medical doctors. So this is, in a way, this was the scenario with the most positive responses, positive towards donating data. The lowest willingness globally was found with regard to making data available to for-profit companies. This is a trend that was found in most participating countries, that for-profit companies were the entities that people had the lowest willingness to donate data to. So here you can see it's 67% would not donate, so a majority, and 33% would. So these are the global data. Here you can also see how where Germany, how Germany compares to other countries. This illustration shows the willingness of people to donate data to doctors. This is the brown bar, to non-profit researchers and non-profit research. This is the blue bar, and the green bar is for-profit companies. And here you can see that Germany, with regard to for-profit companies, is one of the lowest. And also overall, when it comes to even doctors, it's not among the highest, despite the fact that it's one of the richest countries, with one of the best healthcare systems. So sometimes when the relatively low willingness of Germans to make data available for research is discussed, it is framed in terms of mistrust. People don't trust institutions. Sometimes people are even talking in terms of using words such as data hoarding, or the unwillingness to share. It's discussed in terms of non-solidaristic behavior. And what we argued in our first paper already is that this is not a very good frame. Even the trust frame might be problematic. Why? So here again, you can see the comparison of people's willingness to make data available. This now compares Germany not to the global sample, but the English-speaking countries. Why? Because many of the English-speaking countries, although of course each has very individual features that makes it unique, but overall, many of the parameters are more similar than between Germany and other countries. So here, the willingness of Germans to make data available for research is really relatively low. So it's 56% compared to 67%. If we look into this with a magnifying glass, so who are they willing to share? Germans are willing to share with doctors, 48%, with non-profit research, 42%, and for-profit research, 23%. This is what you've already seen in the colored bars in the previous slide. What we also found in the German sample is that compared to the English-speaking countries, there are fewer genetic exceptionalists. So it's 43% in the German sample, and 52% in the English-speaking sample. And we also found that those that are more familiar with genetics were more likely to share data. Again, this is something that we found also in some of the other countries. So most of the people in the German sample who said that they are more familiar with genetics, they were more familiar because they had a personal interest in ancestry, in genetic ancestry, or they had experiences due to a genetic condition, or they had professional experience outside of the field genetics that had brought them in contact with genetic information and knowledge. So how do we make sense of the German data? And this is this is the segue to the part that Torsten will talk about, who will dig deeper into how people phrase this. So we already in our 2020 paper in the European Journal of Human Genetics, we challenged that the kind of easy explanation, which is lower levels of trust. Partly that plays a role for sure, but we also, by contextualizing our findings with other similar studies that had been carried out by other colleagues, we found that this idea of the informational self-determination were probably playing a big role. So the German Grundgesetz, which is the German constitution, enshrines a principle that is also seen as shaping the right to informational self-determination. So that, and it says that individuals that have the capacity to determine disclosure and use of his or her personal data. This is a ruling from the German Constitutional Court from 1983, and this has become a very important notion that, and this is our hypothesis, our working hypothesis for our ongoing work, that shapes people's data practices in the sense that they impose a positive duty on people, on individuals, to make a decision that is responsible. So I'll try to put it in different words and put it simpler, rather than cautious decisions with regard to data sharing being an expression necessarily of distrust. We read them as the expression of having made or having accepted the duty to make a responsible decision. So, and a responsible decision, this is what we know. This is also what we know from other studies, which I will talk about in a second. A responsible decision means that you're not following the crowd, you're not doing what everyone else does, but you make a wise and responsible decision that also says something about the type of society you want to live in. So this is the famous Wellcome Trust Ipsos Mori study from 2016 that showed that lots of people are happy to share data for research, actually also with commercial entities, but they need to have the feeling that something is coming back. So it needs to be, I use the word solidaristic. It's not a word that that many of our respondents have used, but solidaristic in the sense that there's some level of reciprocity. Companies can make profits, they have a role in our political economy, but they cannot make obscene profits. Actually, just as a side note, the same theme we now see with people's vaccination decisions, right? It's not only not getting vaccinated, and I'm saying this on the basis of data from a different study that we are running here, doesn't necessarily mean that people distrust and hate authorities, but it can be an expression of the perception of an imbalance in what is asked from citizens and what they get in return. So in this context, I think the title of this report by the Wellcome Trust in 2016, The One-Way Mirror, is a very, very good title. So it's really about an asymmetry that people feel. So again, we know from lots of empirical research, your DNA, your say, many other studies, that people, when it comes to decisions about data sharing, they care about benefits for others, not necessarily only about benefits for them, or not even primarily benefits for themselves, but benefits for other people. Fairness and proportionality of commercial profits, so they're not anti-business overall, but they are quite anti-data sharing with entities where they feel they don't care about patients and citizens' interests. And also they care about relationships with the data users. So one element that is still underexplored in trust relationships around data sharing is the kind of personal level of trust. If people feel that they know the people who use their data, they are more willing to entrust them also with decisions about their data. But I'm now handing over to Torsten, who will tell you something about the data analysis that we're carrying out now.
Thank you, Barbara. And so just to follow up on what Barbara just said, so as you can see from the statistical analysis, we saw certain tendencies to, in the German context particularly, to not be very willing to donate to specifically for-profit companies. And that number was significantly lower than the willingness to donate to medical doctors and to nonprofits. And that's also something that that is noteworthy in this slide where you saw the comparison across all countries, that in Germany, this gap between medical doctors and then for-profit research was significantly greater than in some other cases. It dropped pretty much everywhere, but this gap between willingness to for genetic and medical data to be used by medical doctors and also nonprofit research, and then on the other hand, for-profit research, there was a significant drop that was remarkable. And now, as Barbara said, the big question is, how do we make sense of it? And from the statistical data alone, it's hard to interpret it, but fortunately enough, within the Your DNA, Your Say data, we also have some qualitative answers. And so there was, for each of the donation options, medical doctors, for nonprofit research and then for-profit research, there was a free text field where respondents could enter certain text to justify their decision. And so what we now for this new analysis want to do and are doing is to specifically look at this qualitative data. And probably not surprisingly, if one does large-scale survey research, the moment you use free text fields, the likelihood that respondents also fill out those information drops oftentimes quite significantly. What in our overall sample we see, and when I refer to overall, I'm talking now about the German sample. So of that, we had, as Barbara said, 1,506 responses that were completed surveys that we used for the analysis. And of those 1,500, we have 19% who provided additional justification for their decision, specifically in those three categories: to donate to medical doctors, to nonprofit research, and for-profit research. Or that's an N of 279. And so we specifically focus on that. And what we did was we used those qualitative inputs, the text, and we used first an open coding to go through all those answers. And we tried to just see what is written there. And similar to a grounded theory approach in qualitative research, we tried to translate the text into code. And then from there went on to classify those responses. I did this together with 2 students to improve intercoder reliability. This is still ongoing work, so we will go back to the data. So all we present you now is still a bit of work in progress, but I think there are some remarkable results and tendencies that we can already very nicely interpret. Before I now go into some of those responses, I think it's also important when we look at the qualitative data to see how it compares, statistically speaking, to some of the key characteristics of the data we have. So Barbara, if you could go to the next slide, please. So here you see some of the key characteristics of our sample, and that is both the overall sample that you see in the left column and then the qualitative data sample that we have. When you look at gender, it is actually remarkably similar, the qualitative data we have from respondents to the overall sample. So there is very few differences here. There are some age differences that are noteworthy, and you see those are bolded on the right-hand side in the qualitative data sample. So the key takeaway here is that our sample with regards to the qualitative data is older. So people are overall slightly older in their responses, and quite noteworthy, those under 30, there were fewer who provided answers, and that has to be taken into account when interpreting then the qualitative results. Then if we go further in the key characteristics, we also looked at questions of education, and this, I guess, is not surprising. Our qualitative data sample is, if you will, more educated, or to put it in the terms of the survey, more people had a higher degree, mostly university degrees. And at the same time, which was surprising, also it was slightly higher in terms of those who had no degree or only primary education. And so secondary degree, that's the category that was slightly reduced. But again, that does not really come as a surprise when it comes to open text where people have to and can express themselves. Then with regards to genetic exceptionalism, just one second, Barbara. With regards to genetic exceptionalism and genetic knowledge, what is remarkable to point out here is that for one, and that's also not surprising, with more education, more people are familiar with genetic knowledge. And at the same time, there is more people who consider genetics to be distinct from medical data, and therefore exhibit was within the Your DNA, Your Say study overall be described as genetic exceptionalism. And then with regards to the willingness to donate, there's no significant differences in our sample. So let's now look at some of the responses we got. And first of all, when we started to look at the data, the qualitative data, and sort this, one of the assumptions, at least I had looking at it, was that there must be some sort of a difference in the terms of people who are willing to donate data and those who are not willing to donate it in the way they justify how they make this decision. Remarkably, though, as you will see in the next 3 slides, where we present some of the qualitative responses, what you see is actually that the justifications or the motives for donating or not donating are quite similar for those who are willing to donate and those who are not willing to donate. It's just basically flipped. So those who are not willing to donate have negative associations or ideas about the reason that those who are willing to donate then put forward as a reason to do so. And in the end, it's the same motive, and it's just looked at from 2 different perspectives. And so a first very important theme, but actually statistically speaking, it's a very low percentage of our data, and Barbara already alluded to this, is personal motives. So the idea that people are just, if you will, selfish and don't think about others, it's actually not something that we find in the quantitative data, and also not in the justifications in the qualitative data. Though there are some personal motives that you can find. And for example, a man who says he is willing to donate, late teens or 20 years old, says, if companies use my information to make a profit, I want to be compensated as well. And the idea is, so if that's okay, then I'm willing to donate. And so he ticked, yes, I'm willing to donate. Similarly, a person says, one day this research might help me. And the reason why we coded this as a personal motive is because it was specifically me. Like it could be beneficial to me, and that becomes even more clear in the German statement of this text. It doesn't quite as nicely translate to English. That's why I added this. It could be beneficial. On the other hand, people who are not willing to donate also put personal motives forward. For example, you see here one female saying in her mid-30s, I fear that it is possible for my data to be linked to me, and I don't want companies to know about me. So the idea here is not that there is like a general concern that data could be misused, but specifically it is related to her data and to her as a person. Or another example, I'm not willing, I am not a guinea pig while others make profits. And there again, and that becomes even more clear in this case from previous answers to other ways of donating, that this person is concerned about himself, not herself, not so much about an overall population that would be guinea pigs. And then lastly, my DNA in the hands of pharma companies does not feel safe. And here again, it is the emphasis on my DNA, not others. So, and you see, those are personal motives that can explain why people are willing or not willing to donate. And then, as we've seen, another large aspect is benefits for others, that in other studies have been shown to be important in the way we think about donating or not donating genetic information or medical information. And that's what we see on the next slide, where people actually, and that was a large part of the responses, do not just make individual decisions, but they already anticipate that there are, or that there is a larger population. For example, when one female in her 70s says, new medications will help all humans, and therefore she's willing to donate. And so the idea is, it's not about her, it's about she can contribute to helping all humans. And then you've seen the quote that we used for this talk: for-profit companies don't care about patients' well-being. And you could say, okay, what does it have to do with benefits for others? The idea is that it is about all patients' well-being. And that becomes specifically apparent from the text that this man provided in the first two, for medical data and for nonprofit research, where he said he would donate. And it makes it very clear that the idea is, if for-profit companies were to care about the patient's well-being, not just his, but overall patient's well-being, he would be willing to donate. Or at least it becomes clear from those answers that he would probably reconsider. Other answers that fall in this similar category are things like, it seems beneficial to donate also for others. So there again is some idea of a greater good. Or it is anonymous information. If it helped to develop new medications, I would support this for the greater good. Again, that is something that was said directly in relation to the donation for nonprofit research. And then lastly, generally speaking, it is good for all of us if pharma companies develop new drugs. I just fear that the data is misused. And then again, as you see, the overall idea is the same. We care about others, about society. And then the reason why she still doesn't want to donate is that she fears mistrust, but not her personalized mistrust in her specific data, but overall that data is misused. And that is an important dimension here that again shows that there is an idea of a larger public that is part of this kind of research. And then specifically, we looked also at the relation between for-profit companies and the people who donate, and that we see on the next slide, and that's the last slide for the qualitative research that we looked at. And that specifically refers to this idea of fairness and proportionality of commercial profits. In a way, you have seen this already earlier on as a personal motive, when this one person says, well, if someone else makes profit, like a company, then I want to be compensated. But we find that in, again, quantitatively speaking, even more responses, that people think of the society as a whole. If few make profits, specifically pharma and medical companies, then society should profit. And this is what we consider fairness and proportionality. And so some of the examples here are that a female says, even if some companies make a profit, ultimately it is good for everyone, and therefore she's willing to donate. Or someone asks a female, who is it good for? Indeed for patients, or truly to maximize profits for companies? And again, this is the same logic, just here she does not want to donate because she thinks the answer is it's only to for profits to be maximized. But if it was good for the patients, she would probably reconsider. And then other examples, as long as everyone who contributes to is compensated, I'm fine with donating. So again, the important part here, as long as everyone, not just he as one of the people who donates medical and genetic information, but as long as everyone who contributes is compensated. And this is a theme we see in a lot of the responses. And this is what we also find very interesting, and which makes the idea that those decisions are just an interpretation of mistrust and individualized ideas seem not appropriate to frame this data. And with that being said, I hand back to Barbara, who will wrap it up.
Thank you, Torsten. Don't be worried. I'm not going to start a whole new talk on contact tracing, but what Torsten and I are arguing, and what we will be arguing in our writing up of those data, is that, as Torsten was saying, trust might explain too much and therefore too little. It might be shorthand for much much thicker and more nuanced dynamics that are going on. And it is also not so much a trust between the data subject and the data user that plays a role, of course, but it's also about a systemic, a collective understanding of privacy, a collective understanding of risk and what society we want to live in. And I found that if we use these broader collective notions to frame our data, we see a lot of parallels of things that are going on at the moment. So one thing is one parallel that we see is with data from a multinational comparative qualitative study, where we have data from several countries on contact tracing. Most of them were already published. So it's an interview study where we don't ask people to fill in a form or tick some boxes online, but where we actually talk to them. And contrary to a lot of the representation of what people's reservations about contact tracing apps have been about, the common suggestion is about the lack of trust, it's about concerns about privacy. What we found on the basis of the data from these interviews, and I've been doing this with my colleague Mario-Elaine Lansing in Amsterdam, is that most of the people who do not use the app, they do this not because they say my own data is not safe, but they have concerns about too much surveillance, a power concentration on the side of the government, also sometimes on the side of corporate actors. It's very often concerns about structural inequalities, because lots of people say the poor will feel the burden of over surveillance. We don't trust the government to use this wisely, but this we don't trust the government is not embedded in my own personal experiences with the government, but it's very much embedded in how people represent it, in what I see and feel the government is doing, whose interest the government is protecting. And it's very often seen as not protecting the interests of people, but the interests of corporations, the interests of industry. So here's where it comes together. This is also why I use the contact tracing data. I won't start talking about vaccinations, but I think we see almost the same dynamics in vaccinations as well. And in this very same interview study, people have literally told us, I'm getting vaccinated when the government does something about the climate crisis. Or people said, why should we trust the science on vaccination if the government doesn't trust the science on climate change? So it's very often about a kind of balance, about solidarity in the sense of a reciprocity. And we do not really have, we haven't fully exploited this around the topic of data use and trust. So with this, we're going to stop our talk, and we're very much looking forward to hearing what you think. Of course, these are preliminary conclusions that we're drawing, and to entering a discussion with you. Thanks very much. I'll stop the sharing now. I stopped the sharing, the slide sharing.
Thank you both. That was absolutely fantastic. I think, both. I mean, it was brilliant to have the context. It was wonderful to see the kind of qualitative data as well. I mean, that all of those qualitative comments are something that I've wondered about what to do with and what the potential of them is, and it's great to see that being explored. And I think and then also the link with the contact tracing apps as well was really I think these questions as they go through are really the kind of broader relevance of the kind of stuff that we do around genomics and health data, and how that then links to similar discussions around COVID and health data more generally. I think it's really interesting. I have a lot of questions, but before that, I just have one from Anna as well, who asks, she's interested in knowing where that legal sentiment around the right to self-determination around data kind of comes from. How did that come to be embedded in the kind of legal framework?
Shall I go, Barbara? So in this context, as you've seen also from the ruling of the German Constitutional Court, that goes back to the early 1980s. And in fact, it is related to the census that was supposed to happen in the early 1980s. And this is when this whole topic became really important. And the question was, are you or can you be forced to provide answers for the census? So that was the initial idea. And in this context, the German census was challenged, and the question of whether there's an obligation to provide information. And in this context, the idea of informational self-determination in this very specific and firstly narrow sense was established and then also ruled on. And from there, and this was actually something a lot of people rallied for. There were a lot of grassroots organizations, and I think when you look at the history of Germany, particularly after the Second World War, this was really a very important point where the public rallied around a common interest specifically related to questions of sharing information, of the relation between the government and the public, and where also the rights of each individual in society was really strengthened, and where there was a lot of pushback against government reach in terms of information, not so much regulation. And from there, this law really, or the ruling actually, became very important in medical debates. And every time there were questions about sharing information, was then linked back to those questions of the right to self-determination in terms of your information. And this ruling is then relevant for all sorts of questions we see with the Genetics Diagnostics Act in Germany these days, and also other relevant laws where there is this reference to the right to self-determination of your information.
It's fascinating. I think it's I'm just, I know there's a question in the Q&A. I just wanted to just following up on that, because I think it's really interesting whenever we have the kind of the individual country talks or more local talks on the Ordine or say data, like the kind of richness of the importance of understanding the kind of context in which we're having these discussions. It is interesting that I suppose the extent to which the kind of qualitative analysis that you're doing with the free text responses, the extent to which you think that would be amenable to a kind of comparative analysis, because then both because of the kind of question about the legal framing and the regulatory framing, but also around questions about, so things like the relationship between profit and the kind of motives that one associates with data collection, and that I think you said the kind of the relationship between kind of making profit and making obscene amounts of profit, and the extent to which that is a kind of concern that carries across countries, or whether that's a peculiarly German, European, some other grouping kind of concern.
Oh yeah, I mean, that would be super interesting to look at indeed. But Barbara.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought that far, Richard, but it is, as Torsten is saying, it's a very good question. I think there are two findings that I see coming out of the German data, and one is kind of German specific in the sense that, as Torsten explained, information has a particular role also in the context of the particular German history, and some of that applies to Austria as well. But I think there are also larger lessons in there, and I see that some of the lessons that we learn actually apply to other countries as well. In the Solpan study, for example, this is the COVID-specific study, which comprises 10 European countries and a few Latin American countries, where I don't know the data well enough to say anything about. And those larger findings are that privacy concerns, for example, well, we shouldn't assume that privacy concerns pertain to individual privacy. They might in specific cases, but more often than not, I dare say they do not. So the concerns about people's own privacy is often folded into concerns about what type of society they want to live in and how they want others to be treated. So I'm not saying that people are all altruistic, they care only about others. Torsten has shown the data that people, of course, also talk about their own interests, but it is a collective notion in the sense that those concerns are personal and collective. They're not necessarily individualistic. And I think this frame applies to probably a wide range of other societies as well. It certainly applies to other European countries. And I'm very confident that it applies also to other countries, so that a frame where we conceive of goods such as privacy, autonomy as relational and collective things, where we don't assume that there's always a tension or a trade-off between individual and public interests, but sometimes they are also aligned. And privacy is a very good example. If my privacy is being infringed by my government, society loses something as well, and vice versa. So I think that is a frame that is actually very useful, and I would say much needed for this whole field of research, and also for regulation, I think, frankly speaking.
Thank you. I mean, that does comes into a question actually that in the Q&A about from Gabriella, who's asking if she says, she knows you didn't talk about it, but she's just wondering about what were the main concerns around donation that came up in Germany, and were they mostly around privacy? I mean, I think because within the data there is that kind of question around.
Yeah, it's an excellent question also with regards to what are, like the way Gabriella framed it, with what are the main concerns. This is one thing that we are still kind of where we still have to see how we frame it or make sense of it, in that do we really want to quantify the qualitative responses? And that's always a methodological and highly relevant and touchy debate about how you deal with qualitative and quantitative side by side. And so I will try to say something about the quantitative dimension. So what are the main concerns? And there I can say it is not just, it would be wrong to think it is only privacy concerns, or that this is the main factor that people like state when they say they are not willing to donate, and that this is their biggest concern. There is a lot of other concerns as well. For example, even with medical doctors, questions of what else would they do with this kind of information that is not specifically related to privacy. And so, for example, because in the survey, we specifically also ask if the data is anonymized and so on, right? And so I think this has to be taken into account. But this is not to say that questions of privacy do not come up. It's something that is a common theme. But if I were to put a number to it, to quantify, I would say it's probably a third of the respondents who, in one way or another, allude to this concern. But overall, it's not the only and main dimension. I think this makes the qualitative data also so interesting and rich, that it is not just this unidimensional, oh, we have concerns about our privacy, but rather that there is a whole host of different assumptions, including the ones that we've shown you that relate to questions of proportionality and also questions of who will profit from that. Is it really something that is good for others, including obviously myself? And that's something that Barbara said, right? When we emphasize the greater good, we should not forget that obviously each of those respondents considers themselves, or I would assume so, part of that larger greater good and part of that society. So of course it is also in a way selfish, but it's not just selfish. It also assumes a much larger public or a group that will profit from this kind of research, or where there's a concern with regards to this.
Thank you. I think that actually, yeah, that's quite nicely bridges, I think, towards the question from Chris in the Q&A as well, which is, so she says the comment that she would welcome your thoughts on. There's an interesting quote on the slide about fairness and proportionality, about someone having a career because of your data, which I noticed. I wrote that one down as well, actually, because it's a really, which of course does not only apply in the for-profit question, but does possibly apply to considerations of reciprocity more generally. And so, yeah, Barbara, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I saw the question, and very nice to see your name, Chris. I've been thinking about this since I saw it. I think, yes, it does apply also to research that is not primarily for profit, but I read this statement as an articulation of the perception of somebody's labor having gone, not necessarily unnoticed, but not being fairly rewarded. And not, I don't mean necessarily, or that reward doesn't need to be in financial terms. As we see in our data, as we see in the UDNA-USA data more broadly, and in other studies, this reward is very often a reward that is conceived as help for patients, better clinical applications, and so on. But it seems to articulate this kind of asymmetry, again, that I was talking about earlier. So I see this as a very positive sign that this person is saying that, because the same argument that is now being made about data, I think, is thanks to people like you all who have been drawing attention to the value that data creates. Whereas one could make the same argument with regard to houses that are being built by people who get the minimum wage, and then somebody else makes a fantastic career on the basis of the labor of the people who literally wreck their backs, right? But that's not part of the public discussion. So it is part of the public discussion because many of us have been raising attention to the fact that data are not just out there, but they are created with the help of public infrastructures, with the help of the work and efforts of patients, of healthcare professionals, many of whom are working much harder than they get remunerated for, and so on and so on. So this is how I read it. Tell me if you think that I'm overinterpreting this.
No, I mean, it makes sense to me. But I don't know if Torsten, you wanted to add anything.
Well, just very briefly on that, I think on top of what Barbara pointed out, I think it is a great comment because it also shows that there are certain commonalities in the way data is used for profit and in non-profit research, and that indeed we could think of it as a question like this statement could easily also be made for someone. I don't want a researcher having a great career with my data, right, or with our data. You could read it that way, but in fact, when you look more closely, I think what it really points to is again this idea that there is an unfair use of data, because in non-profit research, it's kind of already built in that despite someone having a career, it may still profit a greater good, or it may contribute to public health in general, and it will be good for everyone. Versus there is this idea that for-profits have particular interests, they have shareholders in mind potentially, and that is an issue that is addressed here. And that also, I would have to go back to see what the answer was in the previous to the donation for profits, for non-profits, excuse me, and see how that relates. But we already took that into account, and we did not only code the individual answers to each of those categories, but rather we also looked at them in relation in a second step. So we went back to, after coding, to the actual statements, and also looked at how do they make sense in relation to their willingness or not willingness to donate to medical doctors and to nonprofit research.
That makes sense. I mean, there's the kind of question for me as well about I suppose the kind of transparency of motives that we associate with the different, that to some extent, donation to for-profit, I mean, it kind of says it in the question, whereas the donation for non-profit, the kind of what you expect somebody to be getting from that is perhaps less obvious as a participant or a data donor. That maybe requires kind of slightly more articulation. I think I just kind of realized what time it was, because I could keep on talking for quite a long time, but if we have only got about 3 minutes left, and I just wanted to come to Gabriella's comment. So it's a comment just as a Latin American who lived in Germany for several years. In her experience, the differences in how we view personal information were always very obvious in terms of use of social media, credit cards, trusting in public service, in public space. And that in a global survey, the highest possible level of willingness to donate data is obviously going to differ between countries. And she likes the approach of thinking about the gaps between the categories in addition to the absolute values. So I think it's it's been absolutely fantastic to hear and to go through that data. And I do think it is something that for me anyway, I think would be worth pursuing in other aspects in other settings in other countries, and again to think about where throughout that 37,000 data sample we can best get value from the free text content. There's always something that isn't necessarily clear how to analyze. I think just congratulations on
Torsten is also a very, very good methodologist besides many other things, so he's the man who has the answers.
Well, I think we'll probably be in touch again, Torsten, for some.
I'm not sure if I have the answers, but at least I like to think about it, and I think it's an interesting challenge to also see how we could utilize that also in a like cross-country comparison, also with regards to the qualitative data. And as you said, I think the remarkable thing is then that I'm sure there are certain aspects in this qualitative answers that are particular to a given country that have to be situated in the interpretation, but at the same time there are dimensions that are global and really are in a way universal, and concerns that are universal. And to kind of uncover that or discern that would be, I think, something that's really worthwhile to do, or at least try to do.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, I was really surprised how closely, in a sense, I mean, although there were differences in the qualitative data versus the overall sample, I mean, there were very few kind of wild differences in who had responded qualitatively, and so yeah, which was heartening, I think. But on that note, I am, unless there are any more questions in the Q&A, or if anybody else has any questions, there's kind of one final call. Otherwise I will draw us to an end, and I'll say, yeah, thank you again so much, Torsten and Barbara, for the time and and the really fascinating discussion this afternoon. This is the last seminar for 2021 of, there we are, still in 2021. I completely lost in terms of years. So the last YDYS You'll Say seminar for 2021, but we will be starting again in January with Gabriela Chavaria and Hetty. Talking about the Latin American data from YDYS You'll Say, which will be fascinating and a great way to start the year. And I was thinking, there's no way in kind of early November I'm going to say like Happy Christmas and things, but I hope that everybody has a good end to the year, and I really look forward to starting off again in January. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.